welcome to Microgravity Mischief. Today's mission here is going to be a Falcon 9 Starlink launch. For the purposes of the video, I'm going to be only launching about 9 of the satellites, but the point is to show you the basic gist of what they're doing and how they get there. So here we've separated our main booster, and we're going to turn it around and burn it about 15 degrees above the horizon so that we can actually gain a little bit of altitude in our boost back burn. And that is due to kind of the conservation of energy. And now we're traveling upwards before we come back down, which allows the Earth, which is rotating at about 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, to rotate underneath us. So it's going to do some of the work to get us back to our launch site for a safe landing. And as you can see, we've crossed our apoapsis and we're on our way down. And the atmosphere is going to do most of the work to slow us down. We're not going to kick on our booster until we get to about 500 meters a second. And you can see we have 860 meters a second of fuel. So that'll give us enough delta V to slow down for a nice soft landing. So here we are coming in, landing gear coming out, and a nice soft gentle touchdown. Now I'm going to switch back to booster separation to show what the second stage actually does. And there we have fairing separation. And this burn is going to be quite a long one because it has a lot less power in the one MVAC engine, as SpaceX would call it. What we're going to do is continue this burn until the teal line, the apoapsis or the AP there on the teal line, is up at about 300 kilometers. I think I actually stopped the burn at about 294 kilometers. And then as the burn stops, SpaceX will initiate a little bit of a tumble so that when they separate the satellites, the individual Starlink satellites will coast away from each other gently. Now you can see there's a little bit of space debris every time SpaceX does a launch, but what's happening here is that we're going to coast up to our apoapsis, which is our highest point, and since our periapsis is down beneath the atmosphere and actually into the ground, it's below ground level, every bit of that debris that's up there is going to travel back to Earth and burn up, land somewhere safely in the ocean. And so now, as we approach perigee or apoapsis, we're going to conduct a burn prograde in the direction we're traveling, speeding up and therefore raising our periapsis up and out of the atmosphere. And so for each one of these small satellites, we have to conduct that burn. So this is about a few months back when SpaceX lost an entire batch of their Starlink satellites due to the solar storm. I think it had something to do with the ability to communicate, and the systems on each individual satellite were not functioning. So they just simply drifted right back into the atmosphere and got gobbled up and burned up and died. So at the end here, with this last one raising up, you're going to see that the second stage booster has a trajectory that's headed directly for the atmosphere, and that will take it out of orbit along with some of the rest of the space debris that they jettisoned. So now that I've done that, I did an equatorial launch due to the fact that the boost back in gameplay is fairly difficult. So what I've done is I've relaunched the satellites now at a 55-degree inclination. So it's more of a polar orbit than it is an equatorial orbit. And at apogee, which is the exact same for all the satellites, I've raised the perigee so that each one of them is 1,000 meters or 1 kilometer higher. So over time, they're going to all continue to separate evenly from each other, creating an equally spaced orbit around the Earth. And so really how this is happening is if every one of them has to travel to their perigee at a different altitude. It's like running around a track in high school. The outer lane has more distance to cover, so because it has more distance to cover and they're really traveling pretty much the same speed, they end up separating because over time that distance adds up. So here you are watching my impatient fast forward mode, getting them to the point where they're all kind of equally separated. And then once we get there, the idea is that I'm going to have to pick one here to start with, and we're going to coast to our apogee again. As our perigee is much lower, we want to continue to raise our perigee so that it's circularized and everything's basically at the same altitude. Now, I'm sure the algorithm that SpaceX uses in their software to automate this whole process can be very, very precise, as the thrust of the ion engines are so low in power that they can control it down to like 1/10 of a mile an hour, and they can really probably dial in their apogee and their perigee to a perfectly circularized orbit. And then as you'll see here in a little bit, I'm going to launch another set of 9 satellites at a negative 55-degree inclination. So they'll be traveling not quite opposite of each other, but close. And you can see that just by maintaining different altitudes, as long as your perigee and your apogee node are kind of in the same place, around the center of mass of Earth, you just kind of pick a spot to line those nodes up, and then you set those nodes at a precise altitude. You can have satellites that are in complete synchronization with each other. And I think therefore that would require very little effort to maintain that orbit safely. And the other thing you'll notice is that ion engines are so efficient. They have such a high ISP, or basically gas mileage, that they can continue to conduct maneuvers for years and years. And if they're not functioning properly, if their internet speed isn't working or something malfunctions on the satellite, they're either going to get deorbited slowly over a 5-year period by not being able to maintain their altitude, because there is no real Kármán line where the atmosphere just ends. Solar radiation pushes atmosphere up and down constantly. So there is a little bit of atmospheric drag, even up at 400 or 300 kilometers, 400 kilometers. Even the International Space Station has to conduct prograde burns to maintain its altitude, because over time, over long periods of time, you tend to decay back into the Earth. So you can see the direction the Earth is rotating versus the direction the satellites are going. And eventually, when you put enough of these bands of satellites up with different inclinations, you get full coverage of the entire globe. So now I've launched the second one, and we're conducting the burn to raise our perigee up to its final resting place. I think actually I conduct 2 burns here. Yeah, at this point I've got the separation just right how I'd like it, and I'm just going to, in 2 separate burns, raise the perigee. And the reason that I split it into 2 burns is because it's a slow acceleration, so you tend to fly through your node, your apoapsis node. So it's a little bit harder to be precise if you're conducting longer burns. So conducting two burns in short order, I can get my altitude set. So I've set the altitude for the descending 55-degree inclination orbit. to about 285 kilometers, and the ascending 55-degree orbit is at 294. So it's about 9 kilometers of separation altitude-wise. So even though they're going to be crossing each other's path, they're not at the same altitude. So the closest they can get to one another is 9 kilometers. I think the overall idea is that SpaceX would have every different orbital inclination, orbital plane of a group of satellites at a different orbital altitude so that they'd never be inclined to collide with each other. But that's where things can get tricky because altitude differences affect node precession, which changes their distance from each other on an orbital plane over time. But in reality, you can just write software for that as well. Self-governing. I mean, this thing can be completely automated because once you get them to their parked orbital altitude, very little is required. And so here we'll show how the speed difference between that they're traveling relative to each other as they cross. Now luckily they're separated by about 9 kilometers there, but you can see that if they were to collide at those velocities, there would be a heck of a lot of debris in space for about 5 years until it deorbits. So there you have it, from start to finish. But that's it. That's pretty much how SpaceX does it. It was interesting to create this video because as I did it, I learned things myself. So leave a like and thanks for watching.